Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast. Today we're recording the final episode of our Islands tour live in Lerwick. Thank you. The Islands tour is sponsored by SSE and we're here in Lerwick in association with Covey. More on that to come. Welcome to the podcast that takes you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald, hello, and this is Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister, Alex Salmond. And on my right, and indeed on the right, is Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
So welcome to Lerwick. We are about, and I looked this up, 130 miles northeast of the Scottish mainland, 200 miles west of Norway. Some national broadcasters won't send what they describe as their flagship debate TV programmes here, but the Holyrood Sources podcast is determined to hear from communities that are usually and too frequently underheard and overlooked. So here we are to have an important conversation today. You'll know this better than I do, but we're closer to Oslo than we are to London. We're closer to Tórshavn and the Faroe Islands than we are to Edinburgh. And all of that is the backdrop, of course, to the unique challenges, but also the opportunities for somewhere like Shetland as well. So on the podcast today, lots to talk about. You can set the agenda, things that I'm sure will come up, fishing, energy, infrastructure. And coming up on the podcast, the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, the MP for Orkney and Shetland, the leader of Shetland Islands Council, a tunnels expert from a global engineering giant, a fisherman, the man who's in charge of the organisation that looks after the seabed. It's a pretty decent lineup, pretty good place to have a conversation. But yes, our agenda is in your hands. If you would like to make a comment, ask a question, raise your hand, and we will get to you. Thank you for being here. We're recording on Tuesday, the 8th of October, and for the first time ever, we're recording in the morning, which I think is serving us well.
Well, there's no drink, so it makes it slightly easier than the night.
It's not serving me well.
That's been a bit of a thing in the past. We did have a lovely curry last night, by the way, at Gurkha Kitchen. Absolute 10 out of 10. Andy, you spent quite a lot of time in Shetland.
Yes.
For various work reasons and whatnot. What is your take on, I suppose, where Shetland is at today in 2024? We talk about, all the way through this island series, we've talked about the challenges and the opportunities.
Yeah, and there are similarities with Shetland and the other islands we've been to. We've been to Stornoway and Kirkwall. Shetland is in many ways a bit of a microcosm for what's happening in Scotland. I mean, if you look at what's here, significant salmon farming interests, transport issues, which we'll talk about, and obviously, a very significant energy transition towards renewables. And I think that the opportunity Shetland has are really pretty massive, to be honest with you. But it's relatively small. It has geographical challenges, it has a lot of geographical opportunities, but there are challenges as well. We know from this series it's not a particularly easy place to get to. It's not the most reliable place to get to. It's not that easy a place to get around either. We talk a lot in the Central Belt about CalMac and the ferry fleet. I think the CalMac ferry fleet averages about 24, 25 years.
Sounds about
the
right.
Shetland ferry fleet's average of nearing 35, 40 years. So there's an ageing fleet, and this island group has to work out how to get its people from one island to the other sustainably, and they're talking about ferries and they're talking about tunnels, as we'll get to in a second. And then, of course, renewables, much like in other parts of Scotland, but I think particularly here, provide an enormous opportunity. Shetland is windy.
Yes.
Shetland is windy.
Certainly.
But the wind is a bit of a double-edged sword because it means that there's a lot of energy produced, but it also makes it cold.
Yeah.
And it also means the heating has to be on more. So the fuel poverty rates are higher here than anywhere else. And I think the circle has to be squared between all the different interests in that. So lots of opportunities, but lots of help and assistance required as well.
Yeah, fuel poverty around 31%, I think, in the latest stats. We will talk about that a little bit later. Geoff, Shetland is, as Andy's kind of alluding to there, it feels like it's kind of the ultimate living example of, your favourite subject, the transition from oil and gas to renewables.
Yeah, it's been exposed to energy for generations, and what I'm really most interested in tonight is to understand the people's this morning.
Normally
in the evening. Feels like nighttime. Because I was looking up about the Viking project that's been highly publicised, and it's 443 megawatts. Now, to give you an idea, here in terms of the scale. That's the third largest in the UK. The other two are Scottish. Scottish Power's at Whiteley. I remember opening it when I was in government. Well, I didn't. The First Minister did, but I was there. And SSE's Clyde. And to give you an idea, the largest in England is 68 megawatts, and I think it's called Keddy. 443 megawatts. Wow. 68 megawatts is the largest in England. This country, the green industrialisation of the UK, will be led by Scotland, and it will be led by the island communities, as we discussed around in our other stops. For me, I'm really keen to understand, is the community fund that the SSE have announced, is it good enough? I've just been speaking to Asif, my taxi driver, the best way to get an understanding of people, and he's saying people don't feel that they've been communicated with particularly well on the nature of the fund. He said, we want to know how we can benefit more. I wonder if that's the views of the wider population, because it's one thing to generate this power, but it's another to ensure that the communities feel that they're going in the same direction as well. So I'm fascinated by that. One other thing, I'm really interested to push the Deputy First Minister and perhaps the Council Leader on Dales Voe. I think that's a wonderful potential facility for decommissioning, and I believe it's a little bit in abeyance just now. It'd be wonderful to understand what the plans are for that, because I know that we're competing with Norway and Denmark for decommissioning work, and perhaps the Scottish Government need to be a bit clearer and stronger on their commitment to local supply chain content.
Really interesting. Now, all of this and more to be discussed on the podcast, which is played and downloaded tens of thousands of times every month. Crucially, as well, as part of these conversations that we've been having, this podcast is listened to by 80% of Scottish parliamentarians, i.e. MSPs and MPs representing Scottish constituencies. So today, we are bridging the gap that may or may not exist, we'll explore that, between this place and Edinburgh, this place and London, and how to enhance that relationship, improve that relationship on behalf of people here. So it's a great chance to send a message. Andy, just a couple of kind of broader thoughts. This podcast does talk about Scottish politics every single week. We're going to talk about investment opportunities here, some of which have been announced even in the last 24 hours, actually. But hanging in the air in Edinburgh are questions about the government's budget. On the way in December, and it's expected to, it might be quite heavy reading for lots of kind of public services. There might be cuts on the way, for example. There's financial pressures to consider. The SNP is currently running a minority government, and it's reported even today, as we're recording, that the Greens, the Scottish Greens, are piling real pressure on the SNP Scottish Government in terms of what they would want in order for their support to get the budget passed.
Yeah, I think we should perhaps ask the Deputy First Minister when she comes up about that too. But I think that the Greens' support, according to the papers this morning, is predicated on what sound like a proposal for very significantly increased taxes. I mean, to be honest with you, this argument has been done to death. You only need to speak to Fraser of Allender or the Scottish Fiscal Commission to understand that at the very least, tax rises are no longer raising extra money. There's a very significant chance that tax rises are now losing us money because our tax base is disintegrating and those who are mobile in the labour market are either leaving or more significantly not coming. It's having an impact on public services. So, for example, consultant doctors who are getting caught in tax traps are going from 5 days to 4 in order to avoid them. Taking capacity out of the health service. There are a lot of these unintended consequences flying around. I think we know enough now to know that we can't increase taxes anymore and actually raise money through it. We will lose money through it if we haven't before. So I would be, given that evidence that has been produced by the likes of Fraser of Allender and the Scottish Fiscal Commission, I'd be pretty surprised if the Scottish Government were picking up the phone to the Greens today and saying, this sounds great, let's do a deal.
And the politics of that, Geoff, are fascinating. You've been a minority government, and part of this is that if the budget doesn't pass, it could spark a chain of events which lead to an early Holyrood election.
Yeah, indeed. Andy's quite accurately summed up the policy, so I'll go on the politics. I mean, I think it'd be madness for the Scottish Government to be seen in any way as kowtowing to the Greens, given what's gone on in the last few months in terms of the jettisoning of that relationship. To have to rely on them again, I think politically would be untenable. Forget the substance for a second. But I don't think any political party in Holyrood right now wants an election. Perhaps the Liberal Democrats might be the one exception to that. They've shown a bit of an increase in vote share around by-elections around the country and might have their tails up. But the Labour Party, I thought the two by-elections in Dundee recently, Anna Sarwar said that they were going to do a double win in Dundee. In fact, the SNP won both seats, which was a good sign for John Swinney and Kate Forbes that they've stabilised things. Nonetheless, their votes still went down considerably in first preferences, one 10%, one 6%. So they don't want an election either. So the Labour and the SNP, the two principal protagonists, don't want one. The Conservatives have just appointed a new leader and have a huge threat from the Reform Party. I just don't see who wants an election just now. So my advice, the SNP should absolutely go out and seek some consensus on an issue-by-issue basis, try and get support for the budget, but don't be shy about calling their bluff. I remember we did it in 2008, and we basically said, okay, put up or shut up, we'll go to the polls, and Labour crumbled. So I don't think people want an early election. I don't think the public wants an early election. So I think the politics actually suit the SNP just now if they play it carefully enough.
Interesting. They're too short, aren't they? Two MSPs short. That's the support they're looking for. Right, good. Lots more from Geoff and Andy to come throughout the podcast, but let's crack on with some of our brilliant guests that we've got for today. And let's begin our special here in Lerwick with Alistair Carmichael, Liberal Democrat MP for Orkney and Shetland. Welcome, Alistair. I'm going to go there. It's me. You stay there. Alistair, thank you very much.
Good morning, Calum. Where do you want me? Which of the Holyrood Sources cushions? No expense spared on the branding here, guys.
Well, the cushion doesn't matter because you've been branded by a microphone, so you now have absolutely no escape from this.
You can take one as a souvenir if you like, Alistair.
No, I'd have to declare it. We all know that never ends well.
I forget the freebies thing is still a thing. Alistair, you've been an MP continually since 2001.
A few years, yeah.
I believe. How has that time helped with the acknowledgement of the importance of these islands to Scotland and to the UK?
Well, I mean, look, it's been up and down over these years. And incidentally, guys, welcome to Lerwick.
Thank you.
And let's just say that this should be the last of your current round of island tours. And when you come back, you can go somewhere outside Lerwick. Because don't think that you know Shetland just because you've come to Lerwick. There's a lot more out there for you to see and to learn. And maybe even one day you might be able to drive to some of these places instead of having to wait for a ferry. But that's another story altogether. So to come back to your question, look, Shetland has always been, or maybe not always, certainly in the last 50 years since the coming of oil and gas, absolutely at the centre of the UK's strategic, economic, defence needs. You see it's still there today. You have the coming of a spaceport in Unst, which will take the place of what you used to have there with the RAF station. One of the frustrations that I have, and I think a lot of people in the community have, is that we know that. We understand that really well. But my God, getting that understanding out to people in Edinburgh and in London and previously in Brussels was never so easy. So, look, yes, there's an enormous amount of untapped potential here. Quite apart from all the things you listed, you've just got a community dynamic here that is self-starting, it is entrepreneurial, it sees an opportunity and it says, how can we do this and what can we get as a community out of this for us? But somehow or another, the political machinery of government doesn't always allow you to get ahead and to do the best for yourself that you actually can. Yeah. I think that's really what you're looking for here. We're not looking for big help and handout and the rest of it. We'll not turn down anything you want to give us, but all we want really is the opportunity to get on and do the best for ourselves.
Yeah. One of the themes that I think has emerged when we've stopped off in Lewis and Orkney, and here we are in Shetland, is this idea that actually these communities are powerful. You have power, both literally and metaphorically. And actually, Torquil Crichton in Stornoway, the new MP for Nachillen and Anir, the Western Isles, said it potentially best so far in that the axis of power of Scotland, which used to be the kind of industrial central belt, is being redrawn to be these island and coastal communities that have got so much potential.
Well, yes, up to a point. So the infrastructure, certainly physically, you can see here all around you. I think it would be stretching things a bit to say that actually the power in terms of the politics and the decision-making is sitting in Lerwick today or elsewhere in Shetland. I think you will find in fact, that on that, frustratingly, we've been in a one-way ratchet for the last 20 years, and it has been pulling power back to the centre, away from the communities. It's more difficult to get local decisions made in a timescale that the community would want, and on the issues that they want to see dealt with. So,
I was going to say, Alistair, we teased this out with Torquil, and we teased this out with Liam MacArthur, your colleague in Orkney as well, and I just wanted to really hammer the point that Calum was bringing to the fore. I mean, I think if you take the A96 conurbation between Inverness and Aberdein, and you take the islands that we've just mentioned, you cannot get to net zero without those areas. And I put it to you, what I put to your two parliamentary colleagues is this not time to have some sort of informal caucus across these constituencies? Because if you spoke with one voice, prioritise the things that you wanted to see, that's a hell of a compelling offer.
I put it to you, Geoff, it's almost as if you came from a legal family. Look, your point's a good one.
Yeah.
And actually, we are going to come back on to some of the talking about tunnels later.
Yep.
My view, actually, having just had a few days in the Faroe Islands a few weeks ago, is that if you want to build tunnels, then you first have to build a consensus. Because you talk to members of the Faroese Parliament, and granted there are only 30 of them, so building that consensus is perhaps a bit easier there. All they want to talk about is how they build the tunnels. The question of if has been dealt with, that's taken as granted. One of my frustrations, I think, is that that consensus, that caucus, used to exist quite naturally. And I remember in the days of the Highlands and Islands Enterprise, when they would come to London and talk to Highlands and Islands MPs, one of them once said to me, so do you guys have a pre-meeting in this? And this was a group of MPs who came from Liberal Democrats, Labour and the SNP. I laughed. I said, you're lucky to get us all together once, let alone twice. Why do you ask? And he said, well, you so obviously just sing from the same hymn sheet. And actually, the truth of the matter is that in terms of the traditional industries, fishing, farming, fishing as well as fish farming, obviously, the rollout of broadband, the big transport infrastructure projects, there was a genuine and easy community of interest across the parties. Now, something got lost. I fear it was possibly lost somewhere about 2014, which was kind of inevitable, but I think one of the failures has been to reconstruct that political consensus. And my sense is that that's beginning to change, that the discussion is much easier. I would be interested to hear from those in the room who were here in Lerwick yesterday for the Convention of the Highlands and Islands, because my sense is, again, that's becoming a much easier, more positive conversation. And things like the convention, that does give you a forum where you just have that opportunity to exchange ideas and experience without actually having anything at stake. It is a talking shop, but sometimes talking shops are not a bad thing. It does give that opportunity for people to build these relationships, which is how you get things done. So, yeah, I think you're right. The conurbation, and speaking as a former Aberdeenshire resident, I'm not quite sure I recognise the conurbation. I lived in Fyvie.
Fyvie?
Yes, indeed, for 12 years. Well, we can talk about it later.
I was going to say.
Yes. So, that. But you're right, that northeast of Scotland corner, which has a lot of the same interests, energy, through the oil and gas industry, and now the transition, if we can get that just transition into renewables and renewable technology. Agriculture, you've got the big fishing ports of Peterhead and Fraserburgh. We have a community of interest with them. We should be able to work together. Yeah,
can I just ask one quick question, just if I may?
Not about Fyvie.
I'm just very interested on your views on Rosebank. Clearly, it's going through this legal challenge just now, and Equinor have been proceeding with this. I mean,
so Rosebank is the untapped oil field, 80 miles off the west of Shetland.
Yeah. I mean, are you supportive of that going ahead?
Well, look, it's like every new development. You've got to have your carbon tests that have to be met, and if they can be met, then I think, yes, look, it should be able to go ahead. And I think to give some credit to the developers of Rosebank, they've done a lot to decarbonise the extraction plans there. Personally, and don't take this as a Liberal Democrat view because I am a bit of a heretic on this, I think that there is no route to net zero. You do not achieve that just transition unless you go through hydrocarbons first. You actually make it more difficult to get to the just transition. You make it more difficult to get to net zero if you just push the communities and the infrastructure and the industries that you've got off a cliff first.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
In fact, you've said it many times yourself.
Can I just let me draw a couple of things because I know we're going to move on in a moment.
Let me just say before I get killed for saying that, look, this is a different attitude that is understood by the oil and gas industries themselves. The days of maximum exploitation, the sort of drill baby drill culture has well and truly gone. I think they need to do more to explain that to the outside world themselves. The fact that what used to be called Oil and Gas UK is now Offshore Energy UK tells you quite a lot about where their industry has actually changed.
And to help you out from getting into any trouble, I mean, I think it is worth pointing out just once more before, sorry, Andy, you come in, but we as a country imported more than we ever have in the past since the finding of first oil and gas, 40%. And that imported oil is largely coming from America, which is heavy LNG, not good for the environment, certainly not good for the economy and the jobs that we have.
The carbon consequences of that are absolutely
Exactly, so it has to be a managed transition enabled by the world-class supply chain that we have supporting this. Anyway, thank you. Crack on.
Just to draw a couple of things that Alistair said together before we carry on. What Alistair said is linked, actually, that we have talked a lot about devolution this year. We had our event in Edinburgh on 25 years of devolution. You can have a debate as to whether or not devolution has been good for Scotland, and people will have a different view on that. It's difficult to say that devolution has been good for local areas and local authorities. Devolution has centralised a lot of power in Edinburgh. I think that local authorities have struggled under devolution. I think as a consequence, the further away from the central belt you go, the more disempowered communities, I think, have felt recently. I think it can be quite difficult to argue that point, I think. The interesting thing about Shetland, and Alistair mentioned this, is there is a self-confidence about Shetland. We'll speak to Andy Sloan shortly from Covey, who talked about this in the Scotsman today. But there's a self-confidence about Shetland when it comes to big things like tunnels that we'll talk about. And it is possible that you start in a place like this and other places around Scotland say, actually, maybe we've got a bit more power than we think we have. Look at what we've got around here. We've got renewable energy, we've got tourism, we've got food and drink, we've got fishing, we've got aquaculture. Look at what we've got. Maybe the Central Belt need us a little bit more than they think that they do. So, we could be at the start of something here that just turns the tables a little bit and makes it clear that rural and remote areas are a lot more powerful than they think.
I mean, quick thought, Alistair. First of all, let's be careful about talking about all island and rural communities as if they are one homogenous whole, because obviously they are not. I often put it that I am an islander both by birth and by choice, in that I was born and brought up in Islay. I have lived in Orkney for the last 23 years, 25 years in total across my adult life. So I've lived in Orkney and I've represented Orkney and Shetland for the last 23 years. And I see a very different pattern of community engagement and empowerment in the different communities. This is where Shetland has an opportunity to lead, though, because actually there is that self-confidence here, and it is the self-confidence, some of it may be historic and social, and we could take a deep dive into that some other time, but we've got it. And I think, actually, that if the machinery of government in Edinburgh and in London can see that self-confidence and reward it, then that sends a very strong and powerful message to the other island and rural communities, what we call the peripheral communities, and I hate that term. If Shetland can do it, then so can you. And you could by that small element of encouragement and engagement, spark off something that does become much more potent and would take you closer to that point that Torkel Crichton was talking about, where the power actually lies in the communities or away from the centres of population, and not just in Edinburgh and London. Because Andy's right, look, this process of centralisation has been creeping, but it's been pernicious, and now you turn around and you see where we are compared to where we were 25 years ago, and it's not a good place. It has to be turned back. Alistair,
thank you for now. We'll catch up with you before the end of the podcast as well, once we've kind of had a few more conversations, and we'll get your take on that. But for now, Alistair Carmichael.
Well done.
So more to come from Alistair a bit later on. But now let's welcome Daniel Lawson, Executive Officer at Shetland Fishermen. Daniel. Thanks very much for being here, Daniel. As I say, Tuesday morning in Lerwick. Thank you. It's great to see you.
Well, thank you, guys.
Tell us a little bit about Shetland Fishermen. What do you do?
Yeah, I work for Shetland Fishermen's Association, which, as you can imagine, is most of the local fishing fleet come together and we work on their behalf, and that covers everything from policy to some safety and training elements and generally whatever they want me to do. Right, okay. Easiest way of explaining my job is fishermen are busy fishing, so they pay me to come to meetings and things like this and do that side of work for them.
Brilliant. So they are well represented.
I hope so. We'll see.
What I would say about that. Tell us as well then about how important fishing is to Shetland, for those who are listening to this who may need a bit of a wake-up call.
Yep. I mean, you guys, even here for the day, can't help but notice when you're here how important fishing is to Shetland. So, economic terms, obviously, upwards of £130 million a year of fish values alone. But fishing also has the biggest economic multiplier out of all the local industries here. So that value is spread through all the kind of supply chain, ancillary issues, engineering, supplies, all this kind of stuff, as well as the markets and processing. There's also the emotional connection to fishing, which is a lot harder to quantify, but there's a real cultural attachment to it. It's always been a part of our way of life here. Yeah. And when you look around the rest of the country, that's a common historical theme, but not many places have managed to keep it up as well as Shetland have and sustain that fishing fleet. There's also the context to the way the Shetland fishing fleet works. So again, around the rest of the country, they're increasingly corporate, whereas here it's still each boat has its own business, a family-owned business, crews that are paid a part of the share and come from Shetland. So that again, that profit spreads right through the community in a way that, we have aquaculture and we have oil and gas, and Shetland has been fortunate to have all of these things, but none of them are locally owned in the way that the fishing fleet is. And so that's what they like to call community wealth building now. It's important to understand that context when you're speaking about how valuable the fishing fleet is to Shetland, because it's not just the headline figure, it's the way that filters right down through every part of the islands.
I was really keen to ask you a question. I don't know if you guys even know this. My father was a fish merchant in Aberdein, and I still remember, he had a business at reasonable scale, and so he survived and ended up having a very good, solid business. But, throughout the 90s, the common fisheries policies at EU and the tariffs and the quotas really, really killed a lot of fish merchant businesses, and indeed fishing businesses as well in Scotland as licences were given away to other countries, and I'm not getting into that particular argument. I suppose my question to you, though, is given what you've just said, has Shetland managed to withstand those pressures better, given the kind of family-run nature of the industry here? What would be your observation on that? And I suppose linked to that, has the fact we're out of the EU now impacted that at all, for good or for bad?
I think a lot of the reason Shetland has been able to withstand all of those pressures over the past 30, 40 years is obviously there was a solid base of fishing here, so that hasn't fallen away to the same extent it might have. Aberdeen's a pretty good case in a fishing community that no longer really has that economic impetus behind it. But I think a lot of the reason why Shetland has retained that is just the will of the community to, it's just who we are, it's what we do. And that's manifested itself in local authority investment, in port infrastructure, and all that is what you need to keep a fishing industry going. So we have prioritised fishing in a way that other parts of the country maybe have not and have since lost it. to a large extent.
And is there opportunities now, just trying to look for something positive in Brexit from my point of view, but is there anything around that that's impacted the industry that might see you as an opportunity for Shetland fishermen? Or?
Yeah, there's so as part of Brexit and leaving the EU, there has been quota transfers in the way. So certainly for your pelagic fleet, also for your whitefish fleet, the guys will tell you they have more fish to catch now. So that's a clear benefit. And again, that spreads right through our community. There has been trading issues, but I think that's been ironed out to a large extent. It's just been changed for everyone.
I hear Peterhead's feeling the same way. They see a little bit more opportunities, more positive now. Interesting.
I was going to say, Daniel, about 24 hours ago, we sent the First Minister here as something of a warm-up act for today. He was at the Convention of the Highlands and
He didn't make it to the big show.
Yeah, he's not made it to the big show today.
He was hyping you up, I can assure you.
I hope so. He announced that 7 businesses from Shetland will get a share of £14 million from the latest round of Marine Fund Scotland money. There was a couple of announcements related to fishing in this part of the world. What do you make of those announcements? Do they speak to the challenges? Do they help offer solutions? Do they work?
I mean, Marine Fund Scotland is fine. Investment is always welcome. A lot of it's spread out through, so it's not just fishing related. There's quite a lot of yesterday's announcement was aquaculture focused, which is good. Quite a lot of it was for, restoration projects and that kind of thing. So it's anything marine. Yeah. There's been a few grants awarded to help fishermen in Shetland buy new small boats, new fishing vessels, and it's a thing that's often not possible without that kind of government support, because the costs of everything, in every walk of life have just shot up recently, and fishing's no different. I think what we'd like to see from Marine Fund Scotland is, and probably this is true of every government grant scheme going, we need to get back to a multi-year footing, because this year-to-year, hand-to-mouth existence, when you're trying to run projects that might mean real change, is just too difficult. The observer scheme run by Scottish fishermen is quite a good case in point, so it helps provide data to the government that they're kind of legislatively obliged to provide. So we're helping the government out in that way, but you're trying to hire observers on a year-to-year basis. The funding's coming through so late every year that folk are not hanging around because it's not stable, steady employment. So it creates problems every year, and I would really like to see funds go back to that kind of multi-annual funding round.
I don't want to get lost in the weeds of that necessarily just by giving it a fancy title, but this kind of short-termism on fiscal decision-making has actually cropped up on the podcast a bit in the last few weeks. Obviously, we've got budgets coming from the UK government at the end of October. We've got budget coming from the Scottish government as well. But there's actually been quite a lot of talk on the podcast the last few weeks about this kind of short-term stuff is maybe not working as it should.
I think you have to trace that back and say that starts in London, and I think the fiscal framework doesn't really particularly help, and the whole financial arrangement between the UK government and the Scottish government don't help that. So local authorities are frustrated with the Scottish government, but the Scottish government is frustrated with the UK government as well, because of the nature of the block grant and the nature of the fiscal framework. It does make it, in fairness, difficult for the Scottish government to be able to offer that sort of long-term certainty as well. Can I just say on something that Daniel mentioned just sparked a thought there. And I think that, you and I both know the Western Isles very well.
Yep.
And there's a real relationship with locals and the water in the Western Isles. But I think it's actually stronger here than it is anywhere else in Scotland. I mean, you only have to look at a map to see why that is. It is particularly remote. And Shetlanders, I think, in my experience of coming up here, and I'm coming here for a while now, they feel as much ownership of the water as they do of the land. The water is very important to Shetlanders. It's just as much theirs as the land is. And I think that if you look at the way Shetland's industry and Shetland's economy is structured, you can see why that is. But I think it's important context to look at it in that way. So, that's probably part of the reason why the industry has survived arguably better than other parts of the country, is just it's so baked into what people here have in their daily lives.
And doesn't that add to tension when we're talking about offshore renewable energy projects as well, Daniel?
Yes, it does. I'll come to offshore wind in a second. On the point of Shetlanders feeling ownership of their waters, not unusual to hear us speak about Shetland's EEZ. Like, that's just taken as fact. We have unique control here as a community over shellfish fishing within 6 nautical miles. The Shetland Shellfish Management Organisation was one of the first acts of the new Scottish Parliament when it came back into being. So yes, that sense of ownership is definitely there, and therefore anything happening around Shetland is captures the community interest and especially when it interacts with fishing or potentially threatens fishing because of all the things we were talking about in terms of community will. So, yeah, offshore wind we feel a bit stuck with it, to be honest, because in some ways it's steaming on ahead and the legislation just has not caught up to it. So we are seeing east of Shetland, there's 2 developments that have already been leased. The option agreements signed, money paid up for developers to develop there, and they're on prime fishing grounds. Not just for Shetland's fleet, internationally, European, Scandinavian, all fishing here. Millions and millions of pounds worth of fish every year. It seems like such a loss when there could be a win-win. So fishermen here all live in Shetland. We all get that, we need new energy sources and we want to sustain that energy employment that's been so important for Shetland. That's fine. But we could try looking at building these things where we don't fish. So with a bit of foresight, a bit of planning, a bit of early consultation, that could have been achieved, but that's already been lost. So if these sites are developed, the fishing industry will inevitably lose out, and that's going to cause real problems.
If I may come in, Calum, just very quickly on that point. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm surprised, actually, I should know this because this is my hobby horse, but I can't remember if they're INTOG or if they're Scotland licensed. They are Scotland, yeah. Well, maybe put that one to Kate, because I think that should have been considered, and I'm surprised to hear that it's not, and it's disappointed to hear it's not. But this is the tension, and this is the balance that we're going to have to strike as an economy. Yeah. So we have one of the world's largest clusters of subsea engineering capability that can perform particularly floating wind and particularly offshore wind. And that's a great thing, because that gives us a competitive advantage over a lot of our international and nearest neighbours. But we've got to be careful not to do that at the detriment of our traditional industries as well. How that balance is struck, I think that's something that we have to focus on very, very carefully going forward.
Well, just very quickly, Daniel, go on, because we want to...
Arguably something we should have been focusing on 10 plus years ago.
When the licenses were around, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Daniel, that's really helpful. Really, really good to speak to you. And we will revisit these issues next, but also we'll be hearing later on from Ronan O'Hara from Crown Estate Scotland, who basically looks after a lot of land on behalf of the King. He's the boss of the land, is Ronan O'Hara. Not to oversell it. We'll talk to Ronan a little bit later on about some of these things, I'm sure. Daniel Lawson, thank you. Now, let's welcome Kate Forbes, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for the Economy and Gaelic.
Good morning.
Good morning, Deputy First Minister. Thank you for being here. How was the convention of the Highlands and Islands?
Well, you'd be better off asking the audience, which is full of people that were at it. And I think it was really good. It was brilliant. It's my first time chairing. So the Convention of the Highlands and Islands is basically a day that happens once every 6 months. And we get all the local leaders from all the island or Highland mainland local authorities together, as well as some of the public bodies. So Highlands and Islands Enterprise, the NHS, basically anybody that's making decisions in the public sector. And we have conversations about how we can speak with one voice. And I think, the issues that were covered in terms of housing and economic prosperity are all issues that are close to the heart of everybody that was in that room. Yeah,
really interesting. So then, we've already heard a bit this morning here in Lerwick about the challenges and the opportunities facing people here, industry here, jobs here. I mean, reflect, would you, on what Daniel actually just finished by talking about there, that tension between fishing and offshore wind, and the importance of both, and how they might just be struggling to kind of exist together right now.
Well, I suppose that tension has been elevated by the huge expansion of offshore wind, but it's always been a tension. So I appreciate that Shetland has unique characteristics, but I do represent some of the West Coast islands, and there's often a role to be an arbiter, to be a referee, to try and come in between somebody that wants to develop an offshore site for anything, for kelp farming, for salmon farming, or indeed for infrastructure that's required in terms of connecting our islands and how that sits alongside our fishing industry. And I have absolutely no argument with what Daniel said about the need to try and get that right. We have a big concern when it comes to building houses on fertile agricultural land. And it's exactly the same principle in terms of not giving over fertile fishing grounds to some of that big industry. So, I don't defend that. And clearly it's a difficult job getting it right, but the people that generally know these things are the fishermen. So if you start by speaking to them, you're more likely to eliminate that. But considering the scale, 25 gigawatts of offshore floating wind licensing on our seas, it's a huge deal, and I appreciate that a lot of fishermen are feeling squeezed out.
Yeah. Is it an example of where policy and legislation isn't quite clicking? It's not quite making sense, because I want to add to that something you'll have heard at the COHI meeting yesterday of the contrast between the Viking wind farm from SSE Renewables, says it could power up to 500,000 homes, and local people's energy bills here in Shetland, which are among the highest in the country. Fuel poverty is at 31%. And then I'm going to add to this that SSE received more than £2 million in August in constraint payments, where they're given money from the national grid to not produce electricity when supply exceeds demand. Does it feel like there's just something not clicking there?
So I would go so far as to say that this is the greatest injustice for our islands, and indeed for the Highlands, but it is the greatest injustice of our day. It is an absolute shocker, and will be for generations to come, that our islands are responsible for generating such a wealth of power that actually keeps the lights on across this country, and may at some point keep the lights on beyond this country, and yet we have pensioners and others in fuel poverty. And sitting alongside that, we have comments from Greg Jackson, which have been well reported, Chief Executive of Octopus Energy, who says that with reform to the energy market, you could, in Scotland, be paying the cheapest prices anywhere in Europe, and indeed might at times pay nothing. But that requires reform to energy. And my big hope, which I suspect may be disappointed, is that Labour tackles this head on, that really gets to grip with it. You know, GB Energy has its place, right? It'll do what it needs to do. But it's not about tackling that injustice. And what we need is a big vision from the UK government, which the Scottish Government's willing to support, for complete reform that says this is Scotland's energy, and we will not tolerate anyone in fuel poverty that lives within a metre or a mile of these turbines.
I think that, well, you heard the audience. I think that's will be very well received.
I didn't realise your family were in Cape.
That was the first
Ship
minister
them all up.
Maybe he's made it after
just
all.
before, because we're going to get the council leader up in a second as well. But I think bringing all that together, you know, we've heard from Daniel Lawson, we've heard from Kate, we're going to hear from Rowan O'Hara as well, and that's three important legs of that particular stool. But in terms of scale, I mean, the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze is the biggest power station in the world, and it's 22 gigawatts. Okay, ScotWind is bigger than the biggest power station in the world on the Yangtze. It is inconceivable that we cannot make all these economic and social interests work together. It makes no sense that we can't do that. This is such an enormous scale. It's the economic backbone of the entire country and the islands for decades, maybe centuries to come. So it doesn't make any sense that we can't make this work. And I also don't think it makes any sense that we can't do a little bit of reverse engineering if we need to make sure that it does work, to be honest, because the scale is huge.
I just wanted to add one thing. This is going to be the most dominant political issue. I said it before the last general election. Watch this go. The argument that Kate's just made is a forerunner to the Scottish election in Holyrood, because we had this with oil and gas, and then people experienced it. It was new. They didn't really understand, and this generational change was coming. And people started looking, well, wait a minute, we're producing all this stuff, yet we're still paying high fuel bills. Now people have experienced that. We're now getting the second transformation in our economy, and it'll be interesting to see if the public actually respond and say, no, enough of this. This is a nonsense. 31% in fuel poverty in Shetland when they're generating all this. And I wonder if that argument's really going to become more potent in the coming years. But I think the Deputy First Minister's onto something there, because Labour will have to respond to this and respond to it pretty soon, I'd have thought.
Yeah, it's a big issue. Well, Kate's staying on the stage with us. One thing that we set about doing with this Islands tour, which was Geoff's idea, by the way, was the whole idea is, as we say, to bridge any gap that may exist between some of our most rural communities and the decision makers at government level in Holyrood and indeed at Westminster. And so, as a visual and audio representation of that, let's now welcome to the stage Emma Macdonald, the leader of Shetland Islands Council. Hello, Emma. Thank you
Hello.
very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
The last time we spoke was on our podcast special from the SNP conference when we recorded in the corner of the pub.
It was. I don't see any wine here today, though.
And I can't remember that.
Despite
Not my
our best
finest hour.
intentions. It's great to have you both here to kind of have this exact conversation. Emma, talk to us about how you feel the people of Shetland are represented. We're sort of talking about that perception. You know, I mentioned overlooked, underheard, perhaps, when it comes to rural communities. You know, you do a lot of work to address that. Okay. We're trying to do a little bit of that with you as well today. What do you make, for example, of what the Deputy First Minister has just been saying?
So I think if people in our community could hear the Deputy First Minister say that, and hopefully lots of them are listening to this podcast and they will hear that, I think they would be heartened to hear that, but actually what they want to see is action. It's all very well to sit here and say that's a real injustice. That doesn't help people pay their heating bill. So what we need is to move that forward, and we need to see some action.
And what would that look like as far as you're concerned? What would be action that would be satisfactory for you on the council and for people here?
I think we've got a recognition from lots of people. We engage with lots of people in government, in industry, that this isn't fair. I think people recognise that. I think they accept that. But what people need to see is something that takes place that reduces their energy bills. People shouldn't be worried about turning on their heating when they are powering Scotland. Yeah. It's just not okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Deputy First Minister is nodding along.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think this is where the three different levels of government need to work together really closely. And it is worth saying in terms of even things, you know, Shetland has been the most forward-thinking place on community benefit from energy anywhere in Scotland. So the leadership and the foresight 50 years ago in Shetland meant that, you know, at times during the COVID pandemic in particular, I would look at Shetland's reserves and think that they were bigger than the Scottish Government's reserves in those moments because of the commitment to legacy that people in Shetland had at the beginning of the oil boom. And that kind of leadership is what is required today. And I'm very conscious of that fact that what we do, you know, take transmission as one example. £19 billion plus is going to be invested. And, you know, if I had a pylon going up in front of my house, you know, I might have something to say about that too. So therefore, people have to see benefit. We still have, for example, the houses that were built during the hydro years, 50s and 60s, that people are living in. There is a housing crisis being announced in many parts of the country. So what will be the equivalent investment from that major critical infrastructure in housing? That then sits alongside the financial dividends that should be paid to communities. And if a community wind farm is paying out more to communities than a national wind farm owner, there is something that doesn't sit right. But you know, it's not an excuse, it's a fact that the legal powers to enforce that are still at a UK government level, so we need to work collaboratively with them to enforce that.
So on that, would you legislate, if you could, that the national wind farms, as you describe, would have to contribute X percentage of whatever revenue they're generating from any renewable energy project? If you could write that legislation, would you?
To share my own views, I actually am far more sympathetic to these energy companies investing in infrastructure than I am to paying out grants to local communities. There are some communities that have quite significant reserves and funds now because of the community benefit being in grant form, which is voluntary at the moment. I'm far more interested in seeing investment in housing, investment in infrastructure, investment in tunnels and things like that. Because I think that's the legacy benefit that will outlast every politician and indeed might even outlast the wind farm.
Interesting.
I think that's an important point here. This is not about the participants. This is about the rules. Okay, so there are lots of participants involved in this. There are developers, and that's an enormous cost to develop these things. And the perception that the developers are at it and they're making all the money that should be coming to communities is not correct. There's Crown Estate Scotland. They are also playing by the rules, and we'll hear from Ronan in a second. The perception that they're getting lots of money out of this is also not correct. This is all rules-based stuff. The Scottish Government has a set of rules. The UK Government has a set of rules. There's Ofgem to take into consideration. There are the providers, the suppliers to take into consideration as well. The problem, in my view, is that too much of the discussion that takes place on this issue is siloed. So there's actually not enough discussion that brings all of these different interested parties together to create a solution that's actually going to work in the longer term. Because I think what we do know from going around and doing this tour is that you can't forget about bringing the communities with you. Because if you continue to sideline them, I suppose, and we're talking here about the size of their bills, let's be honest, this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about energy bills. If we continue to not have a focus on that, the train will stop at some point. And the country and the local communities can't actually afford for the train to stop. The train has to keep going. But it's about getting together and making sure the rules are changed. Now, I'm quite hopeful. Well, look, in the last 2 weeks, we've had the First Minister and Deputy First Minister here. It's not all that common for you guys to go to the same place at the same time, right? Like the king in the air, right? We don't do that. We don't go to the same place at the same time all the time. So it'd be quite.
Am I the Queen?
I think he's implying you're the heir, Kate, is what he said.
So I think that's fair to say. It'd be quite common for maybe just one of you to come to a place and not both. We've also had the Secretary of State for Scotland here in the last couple of weeks. The national government in Edinburgh and London are taking these places seriously, taking Shetland seriously, right? That's absolutely the case. But I think we need to make sure now that there's a change in government at Westminster and there's a chance for better relations between Bute House and Downing Street than there were before July, that we take advantage of that and really look deeply into this and say, how can we improve the system to make sure everybody wins?
Emma, how would you like to take advantage of that?
I think we need to do that. We need to work better together. I mean, we have really good engagement with the Scottish Government. We work really hard at that, though, because we know how important it is. But we need our communities to be taken with us. And I think we need to work with the UK Government. And we need to get everybody in the room at the same time and just find the solution, because it can't be that difficult to do. And everybody recognises it's something we need to do. So it's like we spoke about yesterday when we were at the convention. We need action. It's all very well sitting having meetings, having discussions, but we actually need action. We need people to see that we're driving that forward and it's not just another talking shop. So I think after these meetings we will get some action, and I'm looking forward to being able to deliver that for the people here.
In a few minutes, we will speak to Andy Sloan from Covey, who is featured in The Scotsman today, as part of a whole number of people who are, incidentally, about the effort that is going into a sort of consultation period and investigation period on the viability of tunnels between some of the Shetland Islands. He says, and we'll put this to Andy in a sec, but he says, self-confidence is the first requisite to great undertakings. Are tunnels going to be a reality in Shetland in our lifetimes, Emma?
I think Shetland is always really forward-looking. You know, we're not just sitting here waiting for things to be done to us. We go out there and we look at how can we transform our islands, how can we make things better. I think tunnels are absolutely something that's deliverable, and I think we're getting recognition of that from government, that this is something that we can do. Obviously, there's a process, and we're going through that at the moment, where we look at what's the best option for each route. But absolutely, I think tunnels could be something that we could realistically do. And I think if we do it here in Shetland first, then it's opportunities for the rest of Scotland. You know, we often lead the way on things. We can lead the way on tunnels.
Yeah. Why are tunnels the answer?
Well, we don't know yet that tunnels are the answer. Obviously, we have to go through the business case. But I think when you look at things not just from a transport, you're looking at how do you transform our islands, how do you look at depopulation, how do you look at really doing things radically different. We've got lots of industry on some of our remote islands. This would be transformational for them. Lots of businesses that could develop, and it's a real opportunity. Lots of house building. There's lots of things that you can do differently if you have connectivity.
Yeah, connectivity, absolutely. And it's come up quite a lot in conversations that I've had, that we've been having in the build-up to today as well, is the connectivity part of all of this. In terms of community support for tunnelling, what is your sense of where people here are at?
I think we've got lots of support in the community for looking at doing something different. Ultimately, people want to be connected. They want to be able to go about their business and do what they want to do. People want to develop their businesses. People want to be able to access things. And I think people see it as a real opportunity, and it's something that we can explore and really kind of deliver on. So I think everybody's quite excited about it here in Shetland. I think there's a real sense of this could make a real difference. Let's just do it.
Yeah. Deputy First Minister, as a kind of final thought, you spent a couple of days here. This is our final episode for now of our Islands tour. What are you going to take away from Shetland after your couple of days visiting?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not my first time in Shetland.
Sure,
I've been
of
in
course,
Shetland
yeah.
a few times. Previous visits have popped into local schools, and yesterday we saw a few housing developments as well. I think what I'm taking away is that the Shetland Isles and the people here have a big vision. They have ambition, and they have always had a big vision and ambition, and they can teach the rest of Scotland quite a lot. The challenge here is that we're in a chicken and egg situation where there's a lot of growth, a lot of potential prosperity, a lot of infrastructure development. The big issue, workforce. What's the big issue for the workforce? Housing. But to build the houses, you go back round, you need the workforce. So I think this is where working very closely with local leaders, and we had some good substantive conversations yesterday, local leaders to say, right, how can we intervene, come in behind you and support you? I see Scottish Government coming in behind local leaders and enabling them rather than replacing them, because it's for the communities here to determine what they want to see, and then us providing maximum flexibility to enable them to achieve their aims.
Really interesting. Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes and Emma Macdonald, leader of Shetland Islands Council. Thank you both very much indeed. It's nice, this. It's nice bringing people together and having these sorts of conversations and hearing the conversation unfolding, I think. And also, what we're sensing, what we've picked up in every stop of the Islands tour is the real optimism, actually the real opportunity. Yes, we talk about challenges, and that's valid, but actually the real opportunity is important as well. Right. Tunnels. Let's welcome Andy Sloan, the Managing Director of Covey in the UK. Covey, an engineering consultancy based in Scandinavia, but Andy's been sort of partnering with Shetland on various things for the last 20 years. Let's welcome Andy Sloan. Andy, hello.
Good morning, gents.
Great to see you. Just, hold that up a little bit for us. Andy, great to see you. Thanks for being here. We referenced the Scotsman today, which is very aptly timed for our visit here to Shetland. There's a front page mention, a double page splash on the potential for tunnels and the project that Emma was just talking about there, investigating the kind of viability. I mean, this is your absolute area of expertise. Is Shetland a prime location, an absolute top candidate for tunnels?
I think the conversation around tunnels has been going on for many, many years in Shetland. I first came here in 2007, 2008, involved in a conversation about tunnels. And over that piece, I've been involved back and forward. Where I am is that building tunnels in Shetland is absolutely feasible. And so Shetland Island Council is going through a process at the moment which we are supporting. And as Emma said, it's quite right that the due process is followed to establish whether tunnels are the right things to connect the islands. But there's a big study going on, and we're part of that study. Our role is, as I said in Scotsman this morning, really about making sure that the practical aspects and the real benefits of tunnels are brought to the fore, brought to this study.
Yeah. Is Brian Hill with us this morning? Brian's here. Brian, would you like to ask your question if I bring you a microphone? Because I think it's relevant to this, so let me just run out. And thank you for being here, Brian. But what would you like to ask?
Thank you. As has been said, there's been much discussion in recent years of the benefits which would come from building tunnels or fixed links between the larger islands. Can the panel advise how this can be progressed from talk to practical steps leading to the actual building of the tunnels or fixed links?
And that's the interesting thing, Andy, and thank you very much, Brian, you'll have expertise there. So we're talking today, there's a whole process that's been outlined a little by Emma, but how long does this take? Why does it take so long? Outline the process from here.
Well, as Emma said, it's right and proper, the process is followed. The outcome of that may or may not be tunnels. Let's see how that process evolves. Once that the decision is popped out, if it was to build tunnels between the various islands. There's a planning process, there is the early development, gathering information on the geology and the rocks under the seabed, the bathymetry studies, then going into a design process and then procurement of the study, procurement of the tunnels, and all of that part up front is probably longer than the actual construction period, because that's the way infrastructure is developed in the UK. It's a long and slow process, and that's one of the things, infrastructure in the UK in general, the planning part of it and the procurement, it takes an awful long time. So that's the part that needs to be focused on if we want to accelerate the construction of any tunnels in Shetland. But you're right about the community benefits. I mean, there was talk earlier in reference to the Faroe Islands,
Yep.
but it's not just the Faroes. The countries to the north of here, Iceland, Norway, they all have seen the benefit of not just tunnels, but connectivity. So take Iceland, for example. The Parliament in Iceland has a real preference to protecting rural communities. That's just the makeup of the Parliament. And in Norway, similarly, they have had for the last 20 or 30 years a focus on rural communities. So that has led to significant investments around the more rural communities to protect, looking at making sure that population is not reversed. And of course the classic is the Faroes, where there's lots and lots of data that really demonstrate the benefits of connecting islands.
The interesting thing for me about all this, I think, is that, and I mean, I've been a bit of an infrastructure bore on this podcast for the last 18 months or so.
Not a bore, Andy.
We have just in Scotland really got out of the habit of doing big things. We just don't do big, ambitious things like that, especially in transport. I mean, we've done the Queensferry crossing, right? Other than that, what have we really done in terms of big transport projects? We've made the M8 a motorway. A lot of people will be horrified to think we didn't have one between our two biggest cities in the first place, rather than making one. And we've talked a lot about the A9, and we continue to talk about the A9 with really quite a small amount of action. Other countries are better at this than we are. A lot better. Yeah. I mean, even our nearest neighbours in Ireland just the other month announced a completely new stretch of 50 miles of brand new motorway in the west from Cork to Limerick, deliberately designed to link up areas outside of Dublin to make sure that business and activities pushed away from Dublin, a decentralising move. So I think it's not good enough to do what we have done over the last few years nationwide and say, we don't have the money for this, we can't do this. It's too, other countries do these things. We can do them as well. More creativity with finance, more creativity with getting it done, and also just a bit of self-confidence, which Andy talked about in his article in The Scotsman tomorrow. We can do these things like anybody else can, and I think there is a first mover thing here. If the concept can be proved by Shetland, then great. That's great for Shetland if the concept can be proved, but it's also great for other islands and remote communities and on the mainland as well, to say there's a model that could be followed for us to actually get a big thing done.
Yeah. Geoff, this potentially falls into the category of things, potentially, that could be the community benefit that we've just been talking about from the income generated from renewable energy.
I mean, Andy's touched on it. I mean, we can be very creative, and we should be creative in how these things are financed. We can go back to the Alistair Carmichael conversation we had at the start. We're taxing energy companies just now at a huge level, way above any other country. But couldn't we be more creative and say, actually, we'll levy you a certain percentage of profit over revenue to invest in these types of projects?
Yeah.
And everyone wins from that basis. You get the economic activity, but also you get some funds put aside for long-term sustainable community benefit. We can be creative.
Yeah.
And we're not creative. We use it as a blunt instrument just now, and we have done, both Scottish and UK governments, for generations, and it's not good enough.
Yeah. Andy Sloan, how expensive is a tunnelling project? I have no concept of how much that would cost, how long it would take.
So we're going through the costing process at the moment of the various tunnels, but Faroe have just published their budget for the next tunnel, which is to Suðuroy, which is 25 kilometres to a population from the mainland of 5,000 people. Their estimate for that, the published estimate for that, is €730 million for 25 kilometres. Okay. Now, the tunnelling prices in the UK, we can't replicate those that have been built in the Faroes before. They were in the past, inflation, etc., rises the prices, but there are procurement that I've described, the planning, insurance landscape, health and safety landscape, all of these elevate the cost compared to the like for like for the Faroes. But that's a useful benchmark at the moment, so in that order.
How do you find, as well, working across the UK? You've talked about planning, and I think planning is a big one for the UK government to really contend with this new Labour government, because if they can do something by reforming planning, it could unleash a whole range of options for housing, for these sorts of infrastructure projects as well. But obviously in Scotland, we have to consider the various stages of government, as we've been touching on already today. How do you find working within those various systems? Is it functional?
Well, I think there's a good reference in the press at the moment. Lower Thames Crossing, which we are involved in, it's the biggest road project in the UK. They've spent 800 million essentially in getting planning. It was supposed to be announced on Friday. It was delayed, and the announcement was yesterday that the government will not announce till the 23rd of May the outcome of 7 or 8 years worth of planning, which will open up the whole of the southeast of England. So there's no real difference across the UK. Planning is a huge issue, and I think in renewables it seems to be as well.
So the planning was 800 million,
Yeah.
and that Faro tunnel was 730 million euros for the tunnel.
Yes.
Well, that's depressing.
Well, that highlights the sort of issue here. That's what you're up against.
I mean, that project, Lower Thames Crossing, if you look at some of the novel ways in terms of procurement, there's lots of the ideas that have been developed in that process that actually have a bearing up here, embedding within the procurement process a drive for low carbon construction. So you're actually incentivizing contractors to build things quickly, but also moving to electric plant or even hydrogen plants. So there's a lot of lessons coming out of projects like that that could have benefit to potential tunnels up here.
Yeah. We're hearing a lot about the potential, which is potentially going to be unleashed. Andy, thank you very much. Great to see you. Andy Sloan from Colchester.
Thank you.
Right, good. Thanks for sticking with us. If you've got questions or points that you want to raise, then let us know. We will hear from Alistair Carmichael, local MP, once again before the end of the podcast. Right now, though, let's welcome Ronan O'Hara, who's the CEO of Crown Estate Scotland, which manages land and property owned by the Crown. Ronan. It's great to see you, Ronan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
No, it's a pleasure. What's the king like as a boss?
Well, no, interesting opening question. Possibly need to go back to a few first principles and establish
totally fair.
some facts. So
No, I just winded you up.
no, but it's an important question. So I think when we talk about the Crown Estate, and in particular we talk about Crown Estate Scotland and the Scottish Crown Estate, we're really talking about a unique portfolio of land and property assets that are vested in the monarch, but importantly held in trust in the Crown to serve the nation. And of course, Crown Estate Scotland is a Scottish public corporation. So we're very much part of the Scottish system. The management of the estate was devolved to ministers in Scotland in 2017, and then the delegation of the management on a day-to-day basis was passed on down through to Crown Estate Scotland. So yes, I'm sidestepping your original question,
No.
but it's a good opportunity to
Absolutely.
set out those basics
Yeah.
because they're so important, and we're here to serve and support the people of Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. We've already heard a little bit on this podcast episode about the tensions in the sea and over the seabed and how the sea is being used and utilised by local people and fishermen here in Shetland and by national companies who are keen to build offshore projects, renewable energy projects. The Crown Estate Scotland is kind of at the heart of that tension, I suppose, and trying to manage that. How would you describe the best way forward in terms of resolving disputes from here?
So I think you're right in saying that we play a very central role because as a landlord, essentially, and a commercial operator, we're at the heart of a number of commercial arrangements which seek to achieve a balance between public, private, third sector, community, and government respective needs. And ultimately, we're at the start of a transition. We're at the start of a journey. There's a huge amount of learning underway. And so in terms of balancing those competing needs, resolving disconnects, the things that strike me as being very key moving forward are, one, the process of continuous learning and ensuring that we are carrying that learning forward into practice. And then dialogue. You know, dialogue. I mean, it's about bringing together, it's convening, it's about allowing views and opinions to be expressed, and then more importantly, ensuring that they're heard. And bringing that through into practice.
Okay, I suppose people here will be wondering what that means in practice. So these are important stages, and everybody acknowledges dialogue is important, conversation is important. I mean, we heard from Daniel on behalf of fishermen earlier saying, "Hang on a second, we feel like we're being overlooked here."
Yeah. So, and I think those are important and valid points because the principle of a just transition, which is what we're really talking about, is taking everybody at the same time on an equitable basis forward to a new paradigm, a new economy. I think in practice, it's back to constant reevaluation, mindful that everything that we do in the seabed is plan-led, policy-led, and that we are constantly, through the periods of replanning, recalibrating. And so we know the one thing that's guaranteed is ongoing and continuous change.
Yeah.
And ensure that that change accommodates and folds in the voices and opinions of the various stakeholders.
Yeah.
So, I mean, not everybody will have read the programme for government cover to cover, I think it's fair to say. I did, unfortunately. One of the most heartening things, I think, that was in the programme for government was just one sentence, but it was a mention of the fact that the Scottish Government may look at reworking the relationship that it has with Crown Estate Scotland. And I thought that was a really interesting section because I've always felt that Crown Estate Scotland, which is, I think it's probably fair to say not everybody in the street knows what Crown Estate Scotland is or what it does. It's not a particularly well-known organisation out there in the pubs and cafes. But actually, it could play, I think, a really important community role, exactly as you've been discussing, so that lots and lots of different interests, from fishermen to people who pay their bills, to people who are impacted by offshore wind in various different ways, have somebody that they feel is actually not just there, but potentially quite invested in that community. And I do think, if you compare the Crown Estate with Crown Estate Scotland, the rules are a little bit different at Westminster than they are at Holyrood. And I think it was quite heartening. I know it's boring, and I know it's political, but I think it was quite heartening to see in the programme for government that there is a potential to just look again at how that all works and actually use the expertise in Crown Estate Scotland for national benefit, but also for local benefit at the same time. And it gets back to what we said earlier. There's a lot of wind out there and there's a lot of sea out there. Right?
Yeah.
There is plenty scope for coexistence here so that everybody wins out of this jackpot that we're potentially about to hit.
So Roland, speak about community benefit, as Andy highlights. Do you think Crown Estate Scotland could be moving more on community benefit?
So when I look at the underlying legislation, we are a creature statute. What that empowers us to do, it empowers us to act and operate in a way that an awful lot of other public entities cannot.
Yeah.
And there's an opportunity there. And that opportunity is to operate at a national level, but also very much at a community level. And when I look at our core purpose, as defined by the board, it is to invest in buildings and natural resources and people to create lasting value for Scotland. And we've been working over the last year, again with the board, to set out that long-term strategic ambition. And the view is remarkably simple and clear and crisp. And it's about becoming a long-term national wealth fund. And in doing so, while we move forward to create wealth for Scotland and the people of Scotland to benefit the environment. And we have the wherewithal from a legislative perspective to do that. And it is about reinvesting back into the communities where we have assets under management, and that we view ourselves increasingly as an organisation that seeks to serve and support the communities where there are assets under management.
I actually think the developers want, I'm interested to see what Geoff thinks about this, but I think that the developers themselves also, I think they want to invest in something better. Yeah. I think they want to be involved in something which has more of a lasting impact than what you might call traditional community benefit. So I actually don't think it would be all that difficult to get everybody on board, including the developers, with something a bit different. You mentioned before about investing in some of the transport infrastructure. I mean, to them, that's investment in themselves as well, to a significant
I don't want to be a doomsayer here, because the potential's huge and the opportunity's massive, but all that's happened is options on the sites. The developers are looking to see where the supply chain goes. Can we manufacture this thing at scale and at cost before they actually put any steel in the ground and start going through the consenting process? Now, some have come through. In fact, we're going to have a very positive announcement tomorrow at the Floating Offshore Wind Conference about starting to see boots on the grounds in support of one project, but that's just one project. So I think, you know, the role the Crown Estate can play is that kind of intermediary between developers and those who've bought the options, but also working with Marine Scotland, working with colleagues at the Scottish Government and indeed Crown Estate England and indeed the UK Government to really accelerate this stuff and to make it commercially available at scale. That's the important word, commercially available, because right now it's very, very exorbitant, particularly for floating wind. So we need to get more projects to de-risk it and do that in a way that balances people's interests, like the fishermen's organisations that we heard from earlier.
Yeah. Geoff mentions the options on things like Scotland, for example, which Crown Estate Scotland faced quite a lot of criticism for, whether it got a good deal or not. I believe the option fee eventually got to £100,000 per square kilometre of seabed. Is that right, first of all? Yeah. Does that feel like a fair price?
So I recognise and I hear the various historic debates that have taken place around all of that. And my view is that the process that we followed was incredibly rigorous. And, you know, as a public corporation, there's never a situation where individuals are making unilateral, arbitrary decisions. Everything is evidence-based and everything has a rationale. And the scrutiny that was exercised in that process at the time was, in my opinion, like the offering, world-class. And so I genuinely believe that the pricing points struck were right and appropriate for the conditions in Scotland.
Yeah, and fair.
And fair.
Yeah. I suppose then one of the follow-up questions to that is that when you're running these option rounds, could you not build into these leases that developers have to do something by way of community benefit, that they have to give some income to adjacent local communities, that they have to commit to building X kilometres of roads or whatever?
So it's...
I'll let this one.
So, as is often the way, there are a variety of decisions taken about how a cake is carved up or how benefit is achieved and distributed.
Yeah.
And that means there's a multitude of options. So all of those things could always at some stage be open for consideration. I think what's important to recognise is that the arrangement that has been adopted allows for future revenues, and we must remember there will be future incomes coming into Crown Estate Scotland, which will be cycled back into the Scottish Consolidated Fund. And actually, what I don't hear discussion on is how and where and when will those monies be redeployed.
Okay, interesting. Is that am I right or wrong in saying that that's the money that the Finance Secretary has started to spend as a result of this year's budget? Geoff's nodding.
Correct.
Which we spoke about a few weeks ago. So that's potentially quite difficult if the government's having to live kind of year by year, that it has to raid the money, frankly, from Scotland in order to finance itself. Did you want to say something else?
Just a quick point that each successful developer that got a site had to put in a supply chain statement that would demonstrate how they would try and use local Scottish supply chain or UK Scottish supply chain content. It's not legally binding, and there are some reasons why you wouldn't have that, because sometimes we're not going to be able to build this stuff. A lot of this stuff's going to have to be manufactured elsewhere. I hate to say it. What we want is the high value stuff as well, and the fabrication welding. That's why we're seeing Aberdein. That's why we're seeing Cromarty. That's why we're seeing big expansion plans at Aberdein, at Peterhead and Fraserburgh and Buckie. But if we don't have some sort of, in my opinion, community benefit baked in a much more stronger terms, I think that's going to be pretty difficult to sell to people in this room and indeed communities around the country.
Yeah. Go on, Ronan.
If I may, actually, I wasn't actually referring to the option fee monies. I was talking about the long-term revenues.
Yeah.
So I was thinking to that stage
Sure.
beyond. And so in the build-out phase, we obviously have supply chain benefits, which are significant, up to 30 billion. But there's life after that. And I think there's an unresolved question there.
Interesting. And so that's an unresolved question for people here in Shetland, presumably as well, that you can... What message would you like to leave the people of Shetland, people listening here, by way of the opportunity of the future?
Well, I think ultimately we are at the start of a journey.
Yeah.
Things are going to get better. There will be new and additional opportunities beyond what we've already seen. And we should remain hopeful, and we should face into that, as I have observed in my time travelling around the islands, with this sort of spirit and courageous ambition that exists in these islands. Because they will deliver.
Yeah, they will deliver, absolutely. Ronan O'Hara from Crown Estate Scotland, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, we are nearing an end. We want to welcome Alistair Carmichael, MP, back to the stage because he's been enjoying the conversation. He's been an important part of the conversation. So I think it's important that we get a few reflections from your local representative here as well. Alistair, are you feeling enthused?
Absolutely.
That's good.
It's lost in the mists of time now, but actually, the subject of my maiden speech in 2001 in the House of Commons was the Crown Estate.
Really?
And I think the
We
words,
knew that. That's why we orchestrated it.
It all fits perfectly. I think the words I used then were remote and imperious. Yeah. And let me tell you, all
describe
credit to
Crown,
Crown Estate, because there was no
Sure.
such thing as Crown Estate in Scotland. You would never have got anybody like Ronan coming to something like this in 2001. I didn't even get them to answer letters about rents for salmon farms in Shetland. It took a letter from me, actually, to say, I think you should pay for salmon farmers in Shetland to go to London to enjoy the lights on Regent Street at Christmas time, because they are the ones paying for it, before they would even come and talk to me.
Wow.
I mean, it was an outrageous suggestion to make. It was absolutely had no foundation, in fact, but it got them talking to us. And then I was Secretary of State for Scotland when we set up the Smith Commission, which ultimately led to the devolution of Crown Estate. And, you know, if we've learned nothing else about devolution in the last 25 years, is the truth, I think, of what Donald Dewar said, is that it has to be a process and not an event. Yeah. So great progress so far, but look, I think you've got a lot more still to do. Ronan makes a good fist of defending the process that they've been through, and of course, as he says, he's a creature of statute. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the outcomes of that process have not been as good as they could be. So let's see what has happened, let's learn from the mistakes, take new opportunities, and if there are opportunities then for retrofitting community benefit into some of the things that have already been done, let's get on and do it.
Yeah.
Nice.
You might say it's an eventful process.
An eventful process, it certainly has been.
Well, let's crack through another couple of things that we've heard today. Kate Forbes saying the greatest injustice of our time, the fact that communities like this are generating power, but people can't afford to put their heating on.
She's absolutely right. I mean, I was putting this to Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions just a few weeks ago in September, before we went on the conference recess. And I think there is actually now an emerging understanding of that, because the answer I got from Starmer was much more positive and forward-leaning than I would have expected. But look, with all these big changes, there are always going to be the forces of inertia to be overtaken. And again, it comes back to a lot of what we were talking about there with Ronan and the Crown Estate. I think the big corporates will come to the table, but they won't come voluntarily, because in the same way that Ronan's a creature of statute with Crown Estate, and that Emma has her responsibility to the electors in Shetland, you know, they have their accountability mechanisms as well to their shareholders and their corporates. So you've got to, this is where politics comes in. You've got to give them the instruction. You've got to create the environment where they price that in. And you know, this is the political challenge. It's getting government to price in community benefit and not just to think about it once they've already taken all the big decisions that make it that much more difficult.
Just a final one as well, and in terms of what we've heard today, How much easier would tunnels around Shetland make your life?
Oh, I mean, my life, look, let's make this all about me, why don't we? It's
You were
not...
saying off camera, you use your helicopter.
Yeah, absolutely.
And somebody pays
And it's
for
all
it
in the
for
register
you.
of members'
Yeah,
interests, just
exactly,
to
yeah.
clear. No, I mean, it would make my life massively easier, but it would make the life of everybody that much easier. You know, I talk to people all the time in places like Unscale, Polsa, Bresa, and they tell me, you know, I can think of one conversation I had not that long ago with a young mother who came from Unst originally, so that's the topmost island in Shetland. But she said, you know, I've got a family that have got some quite complex health needs, and I just can't take the risk of being 2 ferry journeys away from a hospital if something goes wrong in the middle of the night. Yeah. So it would be, it could be absolutely transformative. You know, I leave you with this final thought, if this is your last question. Tunnels bring enormous opportunities, and you can see the way that these opportunities to grow the economy in the outer islands and Faroes have been taken. That shows you what is possible. But ultimately, a tunnel is a piece of infrastructure. It is a tool. And the outcomes that you get depend on how you use that tool, and that's where it all comes back to politics at the end of the day.
Always does, especially on this podcast. Alistair Carmichael, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I've really enjoyed today. It's been really good. We've ripped through a whole range of issues. There's lots of conversations to be had. If you'll indulge us just for a couple of minutes, just some reflections from Geoff and Andy. And Geoff, actually, you know, you can talk about it today, but I actually want to put to you as well that this Islands tour was your idea as part of the podcast. And I suppose then it's about why you wanted to do it, and as we conclude it over this next couple of minutes, how you're assessing its success and benefit.
Why we wanted to do it, because when we started the podcast, we inevitably found ourselves talking about what went in the corridors of power at Holyrood, and I recognised pretty quickly that that wasn't going to appeal to our listeners. I think you guys agreed with me, and we wanted to take the debate and the discussion way beyond Edinburgh, and I think we need to continue doing that. One brief observation. I've been really enthused by the Islands tour, and I think we need to think about how we build upon that. I think Alistair's a good challenge. But there is scepticism about what's ahead, and I think that's justified, because I think there's a lot of good political will just now. I think there's a lot of industry will, but I don't think we're matching the two. And I think a lot of public are sitting there going, well, wait a minute, what is in this for me? How do I benefit my family, my friends with future generations? I don't think we're doing a good job of educating people on what's at stake here and what the opportunities truly are, and indeed being honest and transparent about what the potential risks and the obstacles are that people may have to endure.
Really good point. Andy, reflection from you on today, on the whole tour. I mean, we started in Stornoway just after the election, actually. I think it was about 2 weeks after the election, with brand new MP Torkel Chryson. I mean, he had a real determination and pride in representing his home constituency in Parliament. I mean, we've seen that as we've continued through Orkney and into Shetland as well. There's this feeling, I think, that I'm sensing in the islands of real determination that this is an opportunity, this is a moment of opportunity to be captured.
Yeah, I think the things I take, well, firstly, the 3 groups of islands we've been to are more similar than they perhaps would necessarily want to acknowledge themselves, I think it's fair to say. You know, energy, absolutely, you know, renewable energy, very big. Fisheries and aquaculture, very significant. Food and drink, very significant. Tourism to varying degrees, but all significant. So they share an awful lot in common, these 3 island groups. And I think that's one thing that is interesting, I think, for them to reflect on as to how similar they actually are and the power that they could potentially wield. I think things have changed over the last, even just the last year, perhaps even the last 6 months with the change in government in Edinburgh. There's not much argument now at a verbal level that there is significant opportunity here and that central government in Edinburgh and London need to do things a little bit differently to release that potential. Now, a couple of years ago, you might not actually even have got verbal acknowledgement of that. There might have been a bit of denialism about that, a bit of central beltism about that. So I think verbally they're there. The difficulty is unlocking it. So it has to be followed by action, because going away, listening to this podcast, if you're living in Unst with a pretty significant heating bill and with 2 ferries, which might not go today if the wind gets up, okay, the words that you're hearing doesn't help you. So they need action. But I do think that you can't have action until you have the agreement in the first place. So the sort of positive that I think we need to take away with is that there is much more agreement than I think there has ever been before, that things need to change and that the cooperation needs to be significantly enhanced between local government, Scottish government and UK government. Once those building blocks are in place, you can then move on to saying, okay, how do we actually make it happen? And I think we might be at that stage now. So that's my optimistic take on where we are.
There's been a lot of optimism on this tour. If you would join me in thanking Andy Maciver and Geoff Aberdein as well. Yeah, there has been a lot of optimism. Thank you so much for the warm welcome to Lerwick. It's been great to be here with you today for this podcast special. Of course, you can subscribe to the podcast. You can follow us online as well and keep listening. As we say, 80% of Scottish parliamentarians have been listening to this. So hello to you. I imagine some of them are listening even in their office as we speak. Thank you to our guests today, Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister, Alistair Carmichael, the Lib Dem MP for Orkney and Shetland, Emma Macdonald, Leader of Shetland Islands Council, Andy Sloan from Covey, Ronan O'Hara, the CEO of Crown Estate Scotland, and Daniel Lawson from the Shetland Fishermen's Association. I should just say as well, by way of concluding our series, thank you to SSE, who have helped us put this Islands tour on, and thank you specifically to Covey as well, who have backed our Lerwick episode, which we've been really proud and pleased to do. Thank you very much for being here. We'll talk to you again soon.